and be on the road to recovery. And I'm not 100%, but I'm 80, and I figure generally I'm about 130, so that puts me about, 110, something like that. So we're all right. So it's good to be here. Family is important. I don't know what family means to you. I think maybe to some of us it means different things. Some of us come from really good families, don't we? We come from loving and kind and caring and nurturing families, and some people come from bad families, right? I mean, it kind of has all ends of the spectrum. But families are important. They're what make us kind of who we are, and they're our lineage. And it's kind of interesting to think about where we come from, isn't it? And what that really means. How our past affects our future sometimes is something that is interesting. My grandmother's name was Lorena Bell Peppers. You cannot make that up. She was born in 1899. She's one of 13 kids. Her mother died. She was about 15 years old. She raised all of her siblings, and she was my granny. And on my dad's side, my grandmother's name was Lillian Jane McKnight. And she was a kind of a different gal altogether, a little different. But I got some stories about that, but I'll save them. But and they had children, didn't they? And those children she married Ernest Walcher, my grandfather. And Ernest was he's kind of a bad guy, I guess. He just walked out the door one morning when the kids were little and just never came home, And my dad grew up hard and poor because there wasn't no father, lived in Colorado, and he wound up in California and remarried and wound up dying in California, but they never cared much for him. He was kind of all the kids kind of resented him, obviously, for leaving them. They had a son named William Walcher, and that was my dad, William. And then my grandmother married a guy, an Oklahoma guy from Rogers County, Roy Roberts. And that was early on. He went to World War I, 1918. He was a cowboy from the ground up, run oil wells, and wound up in Oregon and ran horses and cattle his whole life. And him and my grandmother, they divorced early on in Colorado, and that's what set up my mother, Julia Roberts, meeting my father, William Walcher, and that's why I exist. And every person in this auditorium this morning has a story. Every one of you here has a past. Every one of you here has grandparents and parents and a family, and that's why you are who you are. That's why your last name is what it is. That's why sometimes you live where you live. Your past has impacted your future, whether or not you think it does, or we think about that often. It's true. It does. It's how it is. Family is something God created. It's something that started in the beginning of time, didn't it? God had Adam, and he said Adam doesn't need to be alone, and he made Eve, and when Eve was created and became Adam's wife, and eventually they had children, and family came into existence, and family has been part of the world ever since that happened. And whether our families are good or our families are bad or what kind of family we're raised in, it becomes irrelevant because we are here, we do exist because these people in our past existed, these people in our past had relationships, and these people in our past were the reason that we exist right now. And if any of those things hadn't happened the way they happened, then you and I wouldn't be here. You ever think about that? That's amazing, isn't it? Every one of those little things that happened is what made you. God, in the Genesis, he met this guy, Abraham. And Abraham was different, right? I don't know why. I don't know why sometimes God looks down at mankind and says, this guy, I'm going to use this guy. But Abraham was reckoned as righteous, right? God saw something within Abraham, and God said, I want this guy to be my guy. And so God told Abraham to leave the land of leave his land, leave his family, leave everything, and go into a land I will show you. And Abraham obeyed God, and God reckoned that as righteous, and God started a relationship with Abraham. And in this relationship with Abraham over these years, God gave Abraham several promises. He says, number one, I'm going to make you a big family. Right? I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. I'm going to make you a huge family. And I'm going to make all these descendants come from you, and kings are going to come from you. And you're going to influence. Your influence is going to impact the world. That's a big thing, isn't it? Because it's true. Abraham impacts the world. The three biggest religions in the world all trace themselves back to Father Abraham. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all trace themselves back to Abraham. Abraham became this Father Abraham, we call him, this father of all this faith, the father of all these different religions. But in Genesis 22:18, God comes to Abraham, and God says, in your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you obeyed my voice. So God makes this huge promise to Abraham thousands of years ago. Bill sung that song, Ancient Words, Long Preserved for Our Walk in This World. These are ancient words. Thousands of years ago, God told Abraham, in your seed, all nations of the earth shall be blessed. And that's why you're standing here today. You're sitting here today because thousands of years ago, God went to Abraham and said, in your seed, all nations shall be blessed. People that look at the Bible, and I think I did that for most of my life, because I was raised in church, but I didn't know anything about God. That's terrible to say, isn't it? I was raised in church, but I don't know nothing about God. That's awful. But it's true, because people didn't tell me these things. And the truth is, when you look at this story of God and the story of Christ and the story of us and why we're here and what we are, it's ancient and it's prophesied and it's powerful. And thousands of years ago, God made this promise to Abraham, and that's why I'm here today. And that's why you're here today. And that's why we're family today. Because God made us family. It's that past that made our future. And this promise made to Abraham became so important to you and I because it's talking about Christ. This promise that God made, this promise that was going to bring all of us together, this plan, this foreknowledge of God. In Genesis 21:12, though, God kind of brings it down a little bit, doesn't he? He says, but God said to Abraham, so what happens, right? Everybody knows this story? So God tells Abraham, makes him this great promise, in your seed all nations shall be blessed. But guess what? Abraham don't have no sons, right? And so Abraham goes along, and they go along for a long time, and Sarah's getting older, and she's well past barren age. She's 100 years old, right? She gave up having kids a long time ago. And so this goes on, and so they decide, let's fix this. So she gives her Hagar, and Ishmael's born. And Abraham loved Ishmael. Ishmael was Abraham's son. And Abraham implored God, and he said, oh, that my descendants would be named through Ishmael. But God says, no, that's not the plan here, right? That's your plan. That's you and Sarah's plan. It's the wrong plan. That's not my plan. My plan is that I'm going to give you Isaac. And so Sarah, in her old age, at 100 years old, she has Isaac. And God says, my covenant is going to be through Isaac. But God said to Abraham, not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, for through Isaac your descendants shall be named. Through Isaac. So even though Abraham had all these kids, all these, he's going to have other kids through other women, but it's through Isaac that this promise is going to come. Through Isaac that we're going to be named. It's through Isaac because Isaac is the child of promise, you see. You see, Sarah and Abraham, when they realized that, or when they thought, you see, whenever we try to fix God, it's always a problem. God doesn't need us to fix anything, right? I mean, I'm a fixer, and I love to fix things, but God says, Rex, keep your cotton picking hands off. I don't need your help, which is really hard for me to do. You can hold the light, right, but don't touch anything. And so, and I don't ever hold the light right because I'm always trying to look at what I want to look at. And anybody's ever held a light for somebody, you know how that works. But God says, listen, don't help. Right? And so Abraham and Sarah, when they decide to do this with Ishmael, and Hagar goes in and Ishmael's born, and God spares Ishmael's life in the desert. And then from Ishmael, we get Islam. It's one of those conundrums of Scripture. You're like, well, why didn't God just destroy Ishmael? Wouldn't that have made things a whole lot simpler? If God had just let Ishmael die in the wilderness, wouldn't things be a lot simpler today if we didn't have 3 major religions in the world? If we only had maybe 2 major religions in the world, wouldn't life be a little simpler? But I think God always wanted us to learn a lesson. We shouldn't mess with what God does because God said, listen, I've got this. This Isaac is the child I promised you. He's the child of promise. And he is going to be the one through whom my promise comes. Because I want you to understand something. It's not just every descendant of Abraham that's going to be blessed. It's not just all of Abraham's descendants that's going to be blessed. It's specific. He didn't say in your seeds all nations shall be blessed, as Paul would say in Galatians 3, meaning many. In other words, the Jews, the Israelites, thought, oh, we're the blessing of God. The Israelites are God's blessing. But in Galatians 3, Paul says he didn't say to seeds, meaning many. In other words, he didn't say Israel was going to be the blessing. He said that in seed, meaning one, and that being Jesus Christ. So this promise, this lineage, this promise that comes to you and me isn't because of Judaism. It isn't because of Israel. It's because of God. Because God preserved us. God brought us to this point. Because God protected us. And everything that goes on in the Old Testament is to bring us to this point of Jesus Christ. It's our past. It's like my grandparents and my parents. All those things made me. When my grandmother was born and she was a little bitty child, and she was my grandmother was born in 1899. That's hard for me to wrap my head around. My grandmother was born in 1899. And in 1899, my grandmother was born. There weren't televisions, there weren't computers, there weren't hardly cars, I mean, right? And my grandmother had no idea that because she was born, that today I would be standing in Henrietta, Oklahoma, preaching a sermon. You see, you don't know that, do you? You don't know what your kids are going to do or what your life's going to do or the effects of what you do is going to have on the future. You don't know that. But everything you do plays a part in that. And that's exactly what's going on with God here. Everything that's going on is playing a part. And so God takes these Abraham, these descendants of Abraham, and we have these 12 sons, right? And we know the story, and they wind up in bondage in Egypt, and for 430 years, God just shuts up and leaves them there. But God never forgot them. God never forgot his family, you see. Because it's an amazing thing in Exodus 1. We call that the book of Exodus because it's the Exodus out of Egypt, right? But the Hebrews call it the book of names. And I think that's such more powerful thought with God. It's where God, after not talking to anybody for 430 years and leaving them in slavery in Egypt, God shows up and God says, I know your name. These are your names. You are my people. You are my family. I know who you are, and I come to redeem you and to take you out of that bondage in Egypt. I have not forgotten you. I know you. These are the names of the sons of Israel. I know you. That idea of name is so important, isn't it? You know, I've got a really unique last name, Walcher. There's not many Walchers in the world. I don't know if you know that or not. I don't know how many other Walchers you know, but there's not many of us. And the truth is, I was always told as a child, if you ever meet another Walcher, you're related. And that's pretty well true, because there's not many of us. That name means something. That name is significant. Your name is significant. It ties you to something. It ties you to your past. It ties your children to their future. Your name is important, and it's important with God. You know, have you ever been around somebody that you thought was maybe more important than you? Most people I'm around I think are more important than me, so it's an easy story for me. But, you know, being around somebody that you thought was more important than you, and you maybe didn't think they really knew who you were, and have you ever had that person ever come up to you and grab your hand and call you by your name? Well, you know how that makes you feel? It makes you feel important, doesn't it? It makes you feel like you mean something, like you have some value. You know, the most amazing thing you can do with our little kids and our children here is to learn their names. I mean, I know that seems like a really stupid thing, but, you know, it means so much. It gives you value, doesn't it? It gives you worth. Your name gives you recognition. Doesn't it? Isn't it so much better when somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey, Rex, how you doing? All right?" When they know you. God knows us. God knows our name. God writes that name down. God has it in a book. It's not just this random thing, but it has this value and it has this meaning. And it has a meaning to God, and it should have a meaning to us. You know, but the Jews, they thought, you know, we got it because we're Jews, because we're Israel. And Israel's going to be saved, and Jews are going to be saved. And it's just because that we're related to Abraham. And if we can trace our lineage back to Abraham, you know, we're good. Because, listen, Jews are God's people. Israel's God's people. As long as I can trace my lineage back to Abraham, I'm fine. And Jews still think that today, and Muslims think if I can trace myself back to Ishmael, right? Trace my lineage back to Abraham. It's really important to them. That lineage means everything. It ties them to God, ties them to their heritage, ties them to where they are. But you and I, we're not Jews. We're not Muslims. I can't trace my lineage back to Abraham. I guess we could if we tried hard enough, maybe. I don't know, but I know I can't. You know, I can't trace myself back to that, and you can't either. But they thought it was so important, that name was so important, that to say, I'm Abraham's child. And John the Baptist comes, and he's baptizing people in the wilderness, and John shows up, and he looks at all these Jews who think it's all because of their name. And he says, do not suppose you can say to yourselves, we have Abraham for our father. For I say to you that from these stones God is able to raise up children to Abraham. The axe is already laid at the root of the trees. Therefore, every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. In other words, John the Baptist says kind of what God said all along. I choose who I choose. Why did God choose Jacob instead of Esau? You know, Paul says, Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. But why? Esau was the eldest. God should have chose Esau, but God chose Jacob. God chose Isaac. God chose Abraham. God chose all these different people, didn't he? God chooses who he chooses. That's an amazing idea. You know, I'm going to tell you something about families. It's wonderful to be born into a good family. It's wonderful to have that lineage and have that heritage. But that's not the only way into a family, is it? I mean, the truth is you can take a child that maybe come from a bad situation or a bad home or whatever, and you can take that child and you can adopt them into your family, right? And you can give them your name if you want, I guess, right? And you can make them part of your family. You can bring them in. Am I right? And in some ways, that's kind of more special than just kind of falling into it, you know? When somebody picks you and decides to love you and chooses you and says, you're going to be mine. not because you're related to me, but because I choose to love you. I mean, that's pretty special, isn't it? You know, you and I can't trace myself back to Abraham, and I don't even know that I could. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I came from Esau. You know, I don't know, right? Jezebel. I have no clue, right? But the truth is that if God says, you're one of mine, if God gives me the opportunity to be in his family and be in his house and choose me and love me because he chooses to love me, then isn't that the most precious thing on earth? And isn't that what God really says? He says, don't say it's because you're just Abraham. God chooses who God chooses. God can raise up out of these stones children from Abraham. So it's not just about lineage. It's about promise. It's about grace. It's about love. It's about family. It's about mercy. It's about all these things that define and illustrate to us what God is within our lives. In Romans 6, listen to what he says. You know, I never understood this. I mean, my whole life, I had this all wrong. I said this the other day, actually. It's kind of stuck with me. You know, my whole life I heard that. Blood is thicker than water. You ever heard that saying? Heard that my whole life. You maybe know what that means. Honest to God, I was all backwards on this thing. Just throwing that down. My whole life, I thought that meant that like family, like my family, like biological family, blood, my blood relation, because in our life, ain't that what we say when we're in Oklahoma? Well, my blood relative, right? So my blood relation is more important than somebody else, right? Somebody other. But that's not what that means. The other day, somebody revealed to me what that actually means. It means that those of us who are born of the blood, those of us who are Christians, who are baptized into Christ, that relationship is thicker than those of us who are born of water, naturally, as related. That this family here is more important than that other family. That blood is thicker than water. Isn't that what Paul says in Romans 6? He says, don't you know that all those who have been baptized into Christ have been baptized into his death? Therefore, we have been buried with him through baptism into death, so as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. You know what Paul's saying there is that when I'm baptized into Christ, I die with Christ. I touch that blood, and you do too, and we become family. Because we're all born again through the blood into the church. Isn't that exactly what we talked about in John 3 with Nicodemus? Remember, Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night, and Nicodemus says, you know, what do I got to do? And Jesus says, unless you're born again, you cannot inherit the kingdom of God. And Nicodemus says, how's that possible? Can I enter back into my mother's womb and be born again? And Jesus says, how can you not understand this? Unless you're born of water and spirits, you cannot enter the kingdom of God. You must be born again. You know how they used to say this statement, and we don't hear it much anymore, but it was called born again Christian. You remember that? Everybody used to go around and say they were a born again Christian. And that's the stupidest thing on earth. I mean, that's the same thing. How can you be born again and not be a Christian, or be a Christian and not be? It just doesn't make any sense. The statement is ludicrous, right? There's no such thing. You can't be an unborn again Christian. Doesn't exist. You can't be a born again non-Christian. Doesn't exist. If you're born again, you are a Christian. You are part of God's family. You are part of his children. You are this family. There's no other way around it. That's not my decision. It's God's decision. I can't put you in this. Only God can put you in this through your obedience to the faith and your baptism. When you're baptized into Christ, you become a child of God and you become part of this family. And we become united as one. And family is important. And that's what I think of as church. To me. That's what it is. It's family. And when you're sick, and when you have stuff done, and when you have problems, I promise you, I got a lot more calls and texts and prayers from this family. Of course, I ain't got a very big family outside here, honestly, but than I did my real family. This is my family, you see. And when you and I really understand that, it makes it more powerful. Because I know that I'm not family because I'm of Abraham's lineage. I'm family because God chose me. He allowed me to be part of this kingdom. It's not the children of the flesh who are children of God, but the children of promise are regarded as descendants. You see? It's not the children of flesh. It's not Abraham's. It doesn't mean I need to trace my lineage back to Abraham, but it's the children of promise. It's the promise, and the promise is made to Abraham, and the promise is Jesus Christ. And when you and I are obedient to the gospel, and you or I are baptized into Jesus Christ, we become children of that promise. That's who we are. And if we're all children of the promise, then we're all family. We're all part of God's family, and we're all heirs of God. In Romans 8, it says, the Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. You know, this idea of being an heir with God is so important for us. So I had a conversation with somebody the other day, and somebody said, what does it mean to be a Christian? And you know what? I thought that was a really interesting question because it seems real simple. What does it mean to be a Christian? It means you're a child of God, right? I mean, that seems pretty simple. They said, what does it really mean to be a Christian? What is it about being a Christian that really makes you want to be a Christian? I said, well, I love Christ. You know, I want that relationship. I'm able to pray to God. I'm able to, I know God helps me and God guides me and I believe in God's providence. And they says, no, why do you really want to be a Christian? I'm like, well, because I'm an heir. I mean, I'll be honest about it. I really want to be a Christian because I'm an heir. You know, I mean, if Bill Gates wanted to be part of his family, you might not even like Bill Gates, but if you thought, dang, I can be an heir, I might consider it. Right? You know. But, you know, you and I, we get to be an heir of eternity. And what are we an heir of? We're an heir of eternal life. We're an heir of heaven. We're an heir of the glory that we will have with God, that Christ had with God. We're fellow heirs with Jesus Christ. We are children. We are sons of God. And even though I'm not part of that biological family, I'm not a descendant of Abraham, I have been grafted in, I've been adopted into that family, and I'm an heir just as much as anybody else is, and you are, with Jesus Christ. In eternity is our, because this is our forever family. You know, my family on earth, I love some of them I love and some of them I really don't. I mean, I'm just being 100% honest about it, right? But the truth is that unless they're part of this family, my relationship with them is only going to last as long as they do or I do. But this family is forever. You know, I think about that a lot, what that means. I think about that a lot every day, with the relationships we have with one another, with how we treat one another, with how we talk to one another. if we can't make this work here, how are we going to make it work up there? You understand what I'm saying? This has to work. And the reason it has to work is because it's important. Most important. You know, 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul says, forever. And I take it for what it says. And so we shall always be with the Lord. But you know what I see in this is that we're always going to be with each other too. Isn't that what it says? The dead in Christ will rise first, and we who are alive and remain to be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we shall always be with the Lord. This is forever. And Paul says, therefore, he says, comfort one another with these words. Comfort one another. To know that this isn't the end, that this is just the beginning, that things go on after this is over. Well, all I can tell you this morning is, this last week, I've been really thankful for my family. And I want you to know that. And I'll be honest. I don't know how people make it without it. Because, you know, God never intended for us to be alone. God never built us to face life alone or to face challenges alone. And I know if you're a big, strong guy, you think you ought to be able to do it all. And I think that's kind of how I think of myself most of the time, honestly. But I know that's not true. And I'm just thankful that I have a family. And I hope that you are too. And if you don't have it, if you're not part of this family, then you're missing out. Because this is the greatest family ever. And I'm looking forward to being with you forever. I really am. And if we can help you in any way, won't you let it be known while we stand.